What is Citizens United and why should we overturn it? In 2008, a documentary called Hillary the Movie came out that was produced by a company called Citizens United. The documentary was critical of Hillary Clinton, and she was running for president at the time. The Federal Election Commission sued Citizens United, and the lawsuit made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the question of the lawsuit became whether corporations have a right to speak independently of campaigns and to use their general corporate treasury funds to produce political speech. Essentially, the question was, can corporations use their incredibly deep pockets to buy advertising time and endorse or denounce a political candidate? First of all, we should go over what is the government supposed to do. The government is supposed to be there to keep people safe, and it's supposed to keep the rules fair so that everyone is able to play on an equal footing. But corporations have spent a lot of time and money unraveling our rights so that they can boost profits. Take estate taxes, for example. The government is trying to protect us here. Estate taxes are also known as a death tax. Estate taxes were put in place so that succeeding generations of wealthy families would have to pay exorbitant amounts of money in estate taxes so that their wealth was diminished over like a millennia. And that will give way for new families to create their own wealth and rise to the top for, a turn up there. And I know that sounds bad, but if estate taxes didn't exist, all of the money would eventually get funneled down to a small group of families, and all of the opportunities would go to them, and we would be left with something resembling a monarchy, which is what we fought a war to get away from. So why did the government not, in fact, keep us safe in the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission? First of all, it wasn't the whole government, it was just the Supreme Court, and it was only 5 out of the 9 justices. The short answer is that in 2010, Citizens United attorneys made a compelling argument to the Supreme Court that corporations should have the same First Amendment rights as real-life people do. And 5 of the justices agreed that it is unconstitutional to put any limits on how much money corporations can spend influencing elections. The court held that speech was equally protected regardless of whether or not the speaker was an individual, such as myself or you, or if that speaker was a corporation. Think of it like this. If Billy Joel wanted to spend his entire net worth singing songs on television about how he wants you to vote for Al Gore to protect the environment, then that's his prerogative and he should be able to do that. And the Supreme Court thinks that corporations should be able to do that too. The actual effect of Citizens United has not had as big of an impact as we might have thought. It turns out that corporations are not as willing to just donate a bunch of money towards campaigns. But what it has led to is the proliferation of a super PAC, which I'm sure you've heard of, but if in case you haven't, super PACs are basically an organization which collects money and then uses that money to produce political speech independent of any campaign. Since the ban on corporate donations directly to campaigns still exists, a super PAC is kind of a loophole. They take money from any person or organization and they put it in a giant fund, and then they decide which candidate they want to support, and then they just run a bunch of ads in favor of that candidate. But why would Citizens United and other corporations want to be able to spend exorbitant amounts of money on getting someone elected? Well, the answer is the same reason as why do you want to get somebody elected? Because your beliefs and your ideals and your principles align with that candidate. And corporations believe that, above all else, that they should be making money. And not just make money, but make a lot of money, and they need to make more money than they did last year, or else that means that they're failing and it's going to scare off investors. Now, we know that that's not true, but that's just the culture of the United States. We know that if some years are good and some years are bad. If you have a good year, maybe that means you got a house or a new car. And maybe if you had a bad year, maybe you crashed your car or made a bad investment. But that's the circle of life. And that circle of life exists in business too. And that's why we have to pay estate taxes so that new families have an opportunity to grow their own wealth. And that's why companies have to abide by these regulations at a hefty price. Because the idea is that somebody will come along with a better idea or a better way to make a product or a service, and they will be able to implement that idea and increase everybody's value of life and happiness. And we want them to do that. If a corporation's main objective is to just maximize profits all the time, then they are not going to want to follow the rules at a great expense. They're going to want to deregulate the government as much as possible, and they're going to want to elect somebody to deregulate the government that sponsors bills and writes laws to make it so it's easier to not pay workers overtime or to dispose of their waste in Lake Michigan instead of in a proper way. Some people would argue that the market will just adjust itself. A famous economist by the name of Adam Smith wrote about the, quote, invisible hand of the free market, basically saying that the freedom of choice is what dictates what is profitable and what is not profitable. Because individuals do not wake up and produce goods for themselves, but rather they wake up and they choose to produce goods that other people want so that they can get paid for those goods and then do what they want with that money. The idea is that people vote with their dollar. Here's an example. If Under Armour and Nike are sitting on the shelf next to each other and you're trying to decide which one to buy, but you have heard stories about how Nike abuses their laborers or pollutes the environment, then you're going to want to buy the Under Armour brand. So Nike would have to change its business practices, which would cost a lot of money, but it would get people to start buying Nike products again once we hear that they're not polluting anymore and that they're paying people overtime. And the idea is that they weren't forced to do that by regulations, but forced to do that by the invisible hand of the free market so that they can continue to make more money. That's the idea anyway. But why don't we just create laws to protect those laborers and the environment in the first place? This is why we need to overturn the decision of Citizens United. It is not fair that huge corporations can donate money to endorse certain candidates to tell us who to vote for, and when everyday Americans like me or you cannot afford to do that. To get this ruling overturned, we the people need to vote for someone who believes that the government should protect its citizens. Vote for someone who believes that it is unfair for giant corporations to spend millions of dollars on advertising space to endorse a corrupt candidate. We need to talk about how the government institutions like the OSHA or the EPA or the Department of Labor are good for everyone and keep our people and our land from being abused and destroyed.